Morning. Today's lecture is In the Hands of Ulysses, a reference, of course, to General Ulysses S. Grant, later, because of his efforts in the Civil War, President of the United States. This lecture takes us from the Battle of Vicksburg to the Confederacy's defeat and Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. During this period of the war, it truly is in the hands of Ulysses. I love this quote from the Psalms. It was quoted by General Lee. "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight." Why do I love that quote? Well, it suggests the complexity of the Bible's message to humanity and the complexity of our life here on earth. There seems to me to be no escaping the fact that there are times when fighting, when war is absolutely necessary. Obviously, I'm not a Quaker. I'm not a pacifist in this regard. And when we do fight, when we are compelled to fight, we should rely upon the Lord, our strength, who teaches our hands to war and our fingers to fight. While Union General George Meade was stopping the Confederate advance in the East, in the Eastern Theater of the War, at Gettysburg, General Ulysses Grant was attempting to smite the South in two at Vicksburg on the Mississippi. I have written here a little bit of a pun. See if you can figure out why it's a pun. I was going to say, and will say now, Ulysses Grant was attempting to smite the South in twain at Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. Union control of the great river would go far toward Southern defeat. And some historians have argued that Grant's campaign on the Mississippi was even more important than Meade's victory at Gettysburg. I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far, for if Meade had lost at Gettysburg, it was conceivable that at that point, the North would have given up the war and agreed to some kind of negotiated peace, which would have meant the South would go free and independent. No such stakes were at play out at Vicksburg. On the other hand, it is absolutely important to note that Grant's victory at Vicksburg will have tremendous strategic consequences. Well, Grant then at Vicksburg. The Union general positioned his army about 15 miles north of the city of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River. But the surrounding terrain, swampy bayous, thwarted his advances to the city time and time again. And so he decided eventually to approach Vicksburg from the east. In order to do that, he's going to have to cross the river. And the best way to do that, he decided, was to move his soldiers overland south of Vicksburg, cross the river. He would then be east of Vicksburg. In order to accomplish this, though, the crossing of the river, his naval flotilla is going to have to float down past Vicksburg, past its guns, risking destruction from the guns at the fortress of the city of Vicksburg, so that they could get there and then to where Grant is and then transport his army across the river. This was a daring move on the part of the Union Navy, but it is successful. And so now Grant is able to, using the Navy, cross the Great Mississippi River from the west side to the east side, south of the city of Vicksburg. Once he was back in Mississippi, Grant now adopted a new strategy. He would forget the supply lines and live off the countryside. He swept eastward on a campaign that, having learned of it, Lincoln called one of the most brilliant in the world. And he took Jackson, Mississippi, which if you can see on the map is is east of the city of Vicksburg. By taking Jackson, Grant now removes any threat to his rear, for he's now going to turn and march back west and besiege the city of Vicksburg. And so now the great southern bastion on the Mississippi River is surrounded by Grant's forces. Back in the Eastern Theater, the day after Robert E. Lee left the field at Gettysburg, the Confederate commander at Vicksburg surrendered his entire garrison. Upon hearing this glorious news, right on the heels of the victory at Gettysburg, Lincoln said, "The Father of Waters, the Mississippi River, flows unvexed, unchallenged to the sea." And so the Union now controls all of the Mississippi River, all the way down through the port of New Orleans. The South then was effectively cut in half. Chattanooga. Union General William Rosecrans had been pursuing Confederate General Braxton Bragg through Tennessee. And Rosecrans had won a fine victory at Chattanooga in Tennessee in September. But then he had rashly pursued the Confederates into Georgia. He wanted to be aggressive. But at the Battle of Chickamauga, Bragg gave Rosecrans a bloody nose, a disastrous defeat for the Union at Chickamauga. And by the way, General Bragg is the person for whom one of our modern military establishments, Fort Bragg, is named. And I hope you're paying attention to the news and the dispute over monuments and the naming of fortresses and so forth. But Fort Bragg then has been a bastion of American military strength for well over a century. But the naming of Fort Bragg is in dispute now. Well, Union control of Chattanooga was now in jeopardy. Rosecrans has to retreat. But that October of 1863, a monumental change is about to take place. Lincoln now gives Grant command of the entire Western theater of the war. Henry Halleck, who had previously held this command, who had been Grant's superior officer, was moved to Washington, D.C. and given command of all of the Union armies at this point. And then Grant then succeeds to Halleck's position as commander of the Union armies in the West. Of course, he is subordinate to Halleck, who is in command of all armies. Grant now came to eastern Tennessee with reinforcements. He replaced Rosecrans with General George Thomas. Thomas was the man who had actually saved the Union Army at Chickamauga. Had it not been for Thomas, the defeat would have been far worse. And his nickname now, the Rock of Chickamauga. And in a series of battles around Chattanooga, Thomas, assisted by Grant, saved that city for the Union. Grant then pursues the Confederates into the hilly terrain of southern Tennessee as the year 1863 ends. That winter of 1863, 1864, Lincoln pondered the qualities of his commanders. Remember that he had been frustrated year after year, especially in the East, and changed commanders of the Army of Potomac time and time again. Now Lincoln makes a fateful decision. Grant's victories in Tennessee, combined with his victories further out west, confirmed for the president that Grant was the man to finish the job, to end this war. And so in March of 1864, Lincoln gave Grant command of all of the Union armies. Halleck effectively, as historian John Keegan asserts, became Grant's chief of staff. Within the Union armies now, a modern command system was developing. The South failed to develop such a system. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, served both as the political commander, of course, but also as the military commander. Grant versus Lee. In spite of its defeat at Gettysburg, the morale of the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's army, remained very high. Many of these lean, tough veterans had re-enlisted even before the Confederate Congress had required them to do so. In 1864, the hope of the South shifted from its armies to the political situation in the North. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, perhaps the most famous and influential military philosopher theorist in history, wrote that, and I quote, "War is the pursuit of political goals by other than political means." So a war is going to advance, its purpose is to advance political goals by violent measures. This was certainly true of the South in 1864. What do they desire? Freedom, independence from the North. That is a political goal. How are they so far trying to achieve that? Through the use of their armies, by victories in the field. But in 1864, it was clear now that the North was winning, albeit slowly and at great cost. But if the South could hold on until after the election of 1864, November 1864, and in the meantime, perhaps inflict terrible casualties upon the attacking Union forces, then it was possible that a war-weary North would abandon Lincoln and the war to keep the Union together and in slavery, and elect a peace Democrat who would then let the South go. Lincoln and Grant, of course, were well aware of these Southern hopes, and they were determined to crush the South before November 1864, all eyes then turning to the presidential election of that year. Indeed, many in the North hoped that Grant could solve the riddle of Robert E. Lee. Observers saw in Grant a resolution that his predecessors lacked. One said, "He possesses a clear blue eye and an expression as if he determined to drive his head through a brick wall." In May of 1864, 6 months before the election, the Army of the Potomac outnumbered Lee 2-1. And it moved south across the Rappahannock River in Virginia and engaged the Army of Northern Virginia on May 5th and 6th in the Battle of the Wilderness, over roughly the same ground of the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, this well-worn and well-known by this time territory. The armies essentially fought blindly through the dense woods and underbrush. Forest fires now multiplying the horror for the dying who, so wounded, could not move as the fires got closer and closer and eventually burned them alive. The armies then fought in this hellish situation for 2 days. Lee now retreats, though Grant's men suffered more casualties than Lee had. But the South is beginning now to run out of bodies. Still, many of the Union commanders were in awe of Robert E. Lee, as well they should have been. But even that can be taken too far. They feared the Southerner would miraculously appear on their flanks and administer another defeat. Just getting to know his officers in the East and hearing this worry from one of them, Grant, in one of his rare moments of exasperation, Grant, usually very much in control of his emotions, he's very much like Lincoln in that regard, not like other famous military men like George Washington, whose rages were volcanic. Dwight Eisenhower struggled sometimes to maintain his temper, his composure. But Grant, almost always self-contained, but once in a while. And so he said to this officer who was so worried about Robert E. Lee, about what Lee was going to do, he said, and I quote, "Oh, I am heartily tired of hearing what Lee is going to do. Some of you always seem to think he's going to turn a double somersault and land in our rear and on both flanks at the same time. Go back to your command and try to think what we are going to do ourselves instead of what Lee is going to do." Indeed, eminent military historian John Keegan argues that Grant, not Lee, was the great commander of the war. And two recent biographies of Grant, one by Ron Chernow and the other, much shorter and equally good, if not better, by Ronald White, reestablishes Grant's military reputation and his reputation as President of the United States. Ulysses S. Grant, in my opinion, is one of the great Americans in our history. Instead of retreating to lick his wounds, as almost all Union commanders in the Eastern Theater had done after being defeated in the way that Grant frankly was at the Battle of the Wilderness, he now decides to move boldly south on the offensive once again towards Spotsylvania Courthouse. With this decision, the psychology of the war in the East radically changed. Again, this was not how Union commanders had responded to a defeat. The men of the Army of the Potomac had expected to retreat as they always had. Instead, they advanced south. Our spirits rose, recalled one veteran who remembered this moment when they realized they were going to march south instead of retreating, as the turning point of the war. Now, I don't want you to be confused. I argued that the Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point of the war, and it was. But as far as the psychology of the men of the Army of the Potomac was concerned, when Grant here decides to march south instead of retreating, this had a tremendous impact on their morale. And he wrote, "We marched free and began to sing." Lee now barely arrives at Spotsylvania in time to stall Grant's movements. The armies fought there for 5 days in May of 1864. At one point, Hancock's corps, a Union corps, split the southern lines, cutting Lee's army in two, disaster imminent. Now Lee, seeing the hole in his lines himself, rides to the head of the division that he had wisely kept in reserve for just such a moment, and he is about to lead them in a counterattack to close that hole in the Confederate lines. But men of his division, Virginians and Georgians, seeing that Lee was going to lead them in this dangerous counterattack, refused to move until Lee gave up his intent to lead them. They shouted at him, "General Lee to the rear! General Lee to the rear!" And they promised they would drive those people, the Union soldiers, back if Lee would only stay safely behind. Lee had no choice, and his soldiers did what they had promised. As if with one voice, these Virginians and Georgians gave the rebel yell and rushed into the hole that Hancock's corps had created and pushed them back. Stymied at Spotsylvania, Grant once again maneuvered south, forcing Lee to give up his ground to protect Richmond. And you can see the blue lines as they move south and the red lines as Lee continues to have to move to try to cut off Grant as he heads for Richmond. In early June, the next month, the two armies clashed again at Cold Harbor. In 20 minutes, the rebels killed 7,000 Yankees in a failed assault on Lee's defenses at Cold Harbor. Confederates retrieved a diary from a dead Union soldier. The last entry read, June 3rd, 1864, Cold Harbor, Virginia. I was killed. Clearly, this Union soldier wanted to leave his thoughts in the last moment, perhaps for relatives, to know that he was in fact dead, not just missing. After the losses at Cold Harbor, Grant decided to try to outmaneuver Lee once again. He cut away from Cold Harbor and headed south again for Petersburg. Now, Petersburg is actually south of Richmond a few miles. There, Grant dug in for a siege along lines that extended from Richmond down through Petersburg. These lines extended for 25 miles. Grant had decided to fight it out along this line, and I quote, all summer, all autumn, and all winter. So Grant is besieging the area around Richmond, the capital of the South. Meanwhile, he's generously supplied from the Union Navy at the James River, not very far away. That fall and winter, Southern soldiers were beset by hunger and cold. They're being starved, while the Union is being reinforced and well-fed. Thousands of Lee's veterans deserted. Petersburg had effectively become Lee's prison. But Grant's army was not the force it was in May. Although resupplied and to some extent reinforced, the Union could not make good all of Grant's losses so quickly. Though Lee had been forced to retreat for 80 miles across Virginia, Grant's the Army of the Potomac had suffered 65,000 casualties. Casualties now are both killed and wounded. 65,000 casualties in the 2-month campaign. Many of Grant's best and bravest had been lost. Thousands of enlistments were due to expire, and the men were bone weary. As James McPherson, our finest Civil War historian, still has written, no army could take such punishment and retain its fighting edge. There would be no victory in Virginia before the election in November. So the hopes of Lincoln, the hopes of Grant to defeat Robert E. Lee decisively before the election in November, not going to happen. To be sure, the South could not withstand a protracted siege, but it could hold out past the November election. Which brings us then back to the Western Theater, Sherman's march to the sea. So the Western Theater has actually moved east into Tennessee and so forth, the Battle of Chattanooga and such. But still it's referred to as the Western Theater. It's west of the Appalachian Mountains, at least for the moment. While Grant was pushing Lee towards Richmond in the east, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who would replace Grant in command of the Western armies, pursued Joseph Johnston into Georgia from Tennessee. Johnston, the Confederate general, skillfully conducted his retreat. Johnston is a superb tactician. But Jefferson Davis was not interested in retreat. He replaced Johnston with John Hood, who was all offense. Indeed, Hood is reckless. 3 times in 8 days, Hood lashed out at Sherman on the offensive, and each time the more numerous Yankees administered a crippling blow to the Confederate forces defending Atlanta. They're wasting men in these ill-advised offensives into the Union Army. Atlanta now lay open to attack. And so Sherman lays siege to the great southern city and cut off the railroad into Atlanta. Hood now abandons Atlanta on September 1st, 1864, well before the November election. The great city of the South was now in Union hands. And Atlanta was a great prize. Its population had doubled during the war. Foundries, factories, munitions plants were built there. It's a railroad hub for the dispersion of these things into various parts of the South and to the Southern armies. Jefferson Davis was well aware of the significance of Atlanta. He said the loss of Atlanta would give them, the Yankees, control of our network of railways and thus paralyze our efforts. This picture of the wounded at Atlanta is a still captured from the movie Gone with the Wind. Indeed, the loss of Atlanta had a tremendous impact on Northern politics as well. And here's the main point of the loss of Atlanta on the part of the South. Because Sherman's victory in Atlanta punctured the growing Democratic Party's movement to elect the former Union General George McClellan President of the United States. McClellan has substantial support from Democrats in the North. And yes, there are significant numbers of Democrats in the North. And many of the kind of willy-washy Republicans might abandon Lincoln and vote for McClellan. And if McClellan was elected, it was going to be on a peace platform, that is, the policy of letting the Southerners go and forming their own nation. The Richmond, Virginia newspaper, The Examiner, wrote, "The disaster in Atlanta came in the very nick of time to save the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party. This defeat obscures the prospect of peace laid so bright. It looked before Atlanta as if Lincoln would be defeated. Indeed, President Lincoln believed he was going to be defeated in the summer of 1864. He saw no hope of being reelected. McClellan would be elected and the South would be able to form its own independent nation, and no resolution then to the slavery issue." The Richmond Examiner continued, "This defeat, as I said, obscures the prospect of peace late so bright. It will also diffuse gloom all over the South." Now, from the city of Atlanta, Sherman laid plans for a march through Georgia, where no organized Southern armies remained. Hood had taken what was left of his army, and he had gone west and then north into Tennessee. He's hoping that by doing this, Sherman will say, "Oh, I've got to go catch Hood," and he will retreat then and chase Hood into Tennessee. Sherman is not going to do anything of the kind. Sherman detaches a small element of his force. There are already Union soldiers in Tennessee, and these, combined with the reinforcements that Sherman sends, are able to defeat Hood at the Battle of Franklin in Tennessee. And Hood's army at that point is disintegrated. In November now, Sherman proposes to march through Georgia. Atlanta is inland. Sherman is going to march all the way from Atlanta to the sea, waging war on the people's will to resist and upon the South's infrastructure. Even people who have really no idea what the Civil War was about or how it was conducted have probably still heard Sherman's march to the sea. It was a real thing. And Sherman now is determined to teach the South a lesson, to teach the South that its government and its armies could not protect the people. In other words, to destroy the morale of the Southern people. Sherman left the city of Atlanta burning, and he set out on his march. 4 separate columns of Sherman's Union Army now cut a swath of destruction that was at some point 60 miles wide. Sherman's army lived off the land, leaving virtually nothing of value in its wake. In December, he does arrive in Savannah and declared the capture of the city to be his Christmas gift to the Union. And so Sherman's march to the sea does leave a significant swath of destruction in its wake, but not the swath of destruction of later Southern apologists and Southern advocates. For these people, Sherman's march to the sea is essentially burning everything and rape and pillage and so forth. It's bad enough as it was, but it wasn't that. Grant now sends orders to Sherman. Remember, Grant's in charge of all the Union armies, to turn to the north, cross the Carolinas, and head for Virginia, where he would join Grant in an effort to catch Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia between the two giant pincers. But before he gets there, Sherman, of course, has to cross South Carolina, that hellhole of secession. And in South Carolina, Sherman wrought even greater destruction than he had in Georgia. Columbia, the capital of South Carolina, was burned to the ground, along with several other southern cities. One Union officer wrote, in Georgia, few houses were burned. In South Carolina, few escaped the torch. Another soldier vengefully said, South Carolina will never want to secede again. I think she has her rights now. Though it does not live in the nation's memory as the March to the Sea does, Sherman's longer march through both South Carolina and North Carolina in the winter over rougher terrain against opposition. Davis put Joseph Johnston in charge of the elements of the Southern Army that he could gather together in the Carolinas to oppose Sherman's march. And Johnston, again, is a brilliant tactician. And so Sherman's march is a far greater military accomplishment than his march through the sea, through Georgia to the sea was. Having witnessed this campaign in the Carolinas firsthand, Johnston remarked, I made up my mind that there had been no such army, since the days of the legions of Julius Caesar. Grant corners Lee. During the early months of 1865, Grant continued his strategy of late 1864, battering and probing the Petersburg lines. Meanwhile, Grant sent another Union general, Philip Sheridan, into the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley is one of the great agricultural valleys in the United States. It is the most important agricultural region of Virginia. It is Lee's source of supply for his armies around Petersburg and Richmond. And Sheridan's job was to decimate the farms there in the Shenandoah Valley. This, combined with news from Georgia, crushes the morale and increased desertion of Southern soldiers. Grant hoped to defeat Lee before Sherman could arrive from his Carolina campaign to help him do so. This seems an odd emotion. I want to defeat Lee, Grant thinks, before I have the help of Sherman. Well, wouldn't he be tempted to wait for Sherman to get there? Perhaps. But he had in mind the morale and the emotions of the Army of the Potomac that had battled Lee's army all these years. And he really kind of wanted the Army of the Potomac, which still dramatically outnumbers Lee, to get the full glory, the full reward for having finally administered the defeat to Lee. So he does hope that the Army of the Potomac can defeat Robert E. Lee before Sherman even arrives in Virginia. Grant's strategic concern, though, was that Lee might escape, might get out of the Petersburg-Richmond halfway encirclement, and then move to the east and then south and unite his army with Johnston. And so a reinforced then Confederate army would still be of great significance in the war. And this is exactly what Lee has in mind in his retreat from Richmond. So on April 2nd, 1865, Grant ordered an assault all along the Petersburg lines. The Army of the Potomac, now sensing the weakness of their hated adversary, fought with a spirit they had not manifested since the middle of the previous year. Meanwhile, Lee's veterans, cold, weary, hungry, and outnumbered by this time nearly 4-1, did not have the strength to hold the ground. Lee now sends word to Davis in Richmond that the Petersburg lines must be abandoned and Richmond had to be given up. And so the Davis government is going to flee to Richmond, and Lee's army is going to abandon the lines and begin to move to the west. Lee is headed for Lynchburg. He hopes to use the railroad there to move south, again, to join Johnston. Jefferson Davis and the government left the city only to be captured by Union cavalry in Georgia on May 10th, 1865. And so the Davis government is now in Union hands as of May of 1865. Lee didn't even make it as far as Davis. Sheridan's cavalry cut off his route to Lynchburg. So Sheridan's cavalry, horse-mounted troops, were able to get out in front of Robert E. Lee's march to the west and keep him from reaching Lynchburg. Grant then, in pursuit, closes around the flanks and so forth of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was surrounded. There were skirmishes now, but Lee eventually realizes that as far as he is concerned, as far as the Army of Northern Virginia is concerned, the war is over. And so he surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9th, 1865. Though sporadic fighting continued for several weeks, the war was effectively over. The immediate and long-term impact of the Civil War is the subject of much of the rest of the class. Well, I thank you for your attention, and I hope that you have followed along this lecture without any difficulty. Again, I pray that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ will be with you all, and that you will receive that grace through faith. Amen.